Muchas gracias, Betlem. Many thanks. Well, I will just start by saying that, well, as we have seen in the previous presentation, in the past decades, initiative for European memory and historical awareness have been primarily focusing on the experience of war, notably World War I and World War II. And because of the scale and outreach of both conflicts, all European societies were touched in one way or another, hence the framework for a common narrative for starters. But more importantly, the overcoming of the recurrence of war is pointed out as the very basis of the European unity process that unfolded during the second half of the 20th century and until now, or until very recently, depending on the views. Yet both work and imagination often stop at this point, at the very link between the two, between war memory and European unity memory. We are told where the efforts to banish war led to, but in the overarching narrative, those efforts lack faces, texture, and undoubtedly pathos. In other words, we are told about what European unity had to overcome over time, but not how European unity did it. And I have to maybe introduce a note here about how and why we thought about with Betlem in the first place about the title of this seminar, but then also why it made a lot of sense to also to ask Aline to be part of this discussion, because back in June last year in Brussels, we started with other colleagues a discussion, general discussion about memory, but there was one specific idea that personally intrigued me a lot, and I think we were not, with the other colleagues, not able to develop sufficiently, which is, what do we make out of solidarity, for example? What do we make out of, actually it was Anna Milosevic from the if I remember well, from the KU Leuven University, who asked this question to the audience, to the other participants very clearly, and we tried to react to that. But I realized then, and Aline again was there, that we didn't have enough answers for that. So my presentation will be very different from Aline's presentation, but then I will, the idea is that we find a common ground in the end for discussion and for actually exchanging on a series of ideas. So I will, for now, move away from some of the questions that Aline just raised, but then at the end, hopefully, I will come back to them. So I will sort of like jump ahead, or like a big leap to a very different question. So it will certainly feel like a huge gap with what we were discussing until now. So my question is there room for a memory of European unity? We haven't even answered to the question, is there room for European memory, period, you know? So, and now I'm already trying to answer, is there room for a memory of European unity? So again, hopefully we'll go back on both things at the end. And then I still have even a previous question. So is a memory of European unity desirable? And of course here I place myself not in a strictly historical domain in terms of study and research, but probably this question belongs more to political science or social communication. But I have to say that until quite recently, I think in a significant part of the literature or the commenting about these questions, there was a certain conundrum, a certain contradiction in terms. Many commentators would used to criticize the institutions for not communicating properly, and then sometimes even in the same article, in the same exposition, you would find also a critique of the institutions for putting certain messages forward. So I often ask myself, which one is it? If we agree that institutions have a duty to communicate, we might agree that they don't, but if they do, I think we can only criticize them for not doing that communication well. So I think it's important not to criticize both things at the same time. So that is something that I think was happening quite importantly until now. And I think in the last years, maybe I'm talking about like 3 years, between 2 years, 3 years, I think the situation has been starting to be dispelled, and in a minute I'm going to try to explain why. I think in societies in Europe, quite recently they have come up with a certain like Gramscian realization, let's say, of in the sense of like if one doesn't come up with its own his or her own narrative, others will do that for you, basically. So I think this comes out more naturally today, let's say, that even in 2010 or in 2012, and I'm going to try to examine why. So before I do that, I'm going to say up front that I think that has opened a window for the memory of European unity in 2 senses. So number one, compared to previous years, the public has come to accept more naturally let's say, the meddling of institutions with historical narratives. And of course, this cannot be done just in any way. And Aline has towards the end of your presentation, you have explained how the Commission tries to do that. For example, that's just one example. And then number two, something that derivates from the first point, I think now we can start for the first time maybe seeing some grassroots efforts that venture in domains that of political institutional history even, that until now were considered too dry, too malleable, and too even tainted by manipulation. So I think this is quite a novelty. And again, I think the explanation is at the end of a quite long evolution. So just to get to my point, I will have to do a very, hopefully short sketching of Europe's history of Europe's self-perception in the last years, basically since Cold War. So if I had to summarize in very big trades, I would say that, well, during the 90s, right after the Cold War, Europe felt destined to become a new superpower with, of course, equidistant between the US and the Soviet Union with different variations depending on the country. And at the same time, both the prospect of common currency and enlargement were great catalysts for the functioning of the whole EU building, the whole architecture, and also the source of forward-looking imagination. So in that context, I'm talking about the 90s, there was in front of, let's say, Europeans as a collective, a clean slate, a wide open future where everything was possible. So there was no clear need for real looking towards history, something that at some point would have been seen as inconveniently surfacing divisive views, if anything. So, so I think until, well, September 2001, when there was, of course, an abrupt awakening about all that, the consequences for on the ground and also for collective imagination probably were not felt until some years later. But of course, we are all aware that that was sort of a landmark in realizing that things were not that easy, the future was not that bright. So I think it is in that moment, and I would say as a product not of something that was happening at a European scale, but something that was happening more like on a binational dimension, that little by little there were some initiatives that started to be, there was a certain willingness to transform them, to make them move to the European sphere. And what I have in mind especially is the Franco-German textbook. If I remember well, that was in around 2003. Well, it was a long process, of course, but we're talking about those years. So for me, it was one of the first moments when, well, there was the experience of the textbook that was a successful one in the sense that, well, it saw the light, it was published. It is true also that is one of the few textbooks where authors, like it was a joint book, where authors had to put footnotes saying, or even like sections explaining where they were disagreeing. So saying, well, the French part didn't see that, especially the role of the United States and other issues, and maybe the German side didn't see the opportunity of mentioning the role of communist resistance also in France. So, but it was a first experience that then there was some attempts to bring to the European level. There was a certain debate that didn't go further, but for me it laid the ground for a wider discussion, whereas before that the necessity maybe had not been felt, or at least not in the same way. Well, we're almost in 2004 when the Big Bang enlargement took place. And then right after, there was no grand narrative to replace the grand narrative of the enlargement, of the reuniting the two sides of Europe, etc. So that's an important point. Then at the same time, there were the political wounds of the Iraq war in Europe. So they were only starting to heal. And then in 2005, when, let's say, a new consensus emerged, the new consensus was under the American umbrella more than before, in the sense that countries all of a sudden learned to be aligned with a certain view that was coincident with Washington more than before. If we look at the French case, it's quite obvious that there's Chirac was one thing, and Sarkozy, well, although it was 2007, but that started already with Villepin. It was something different. So so I think 2005, in this sense, was a year that was very kind of an annus horribilis, that there was a coincidence of very many bad news. And it was also the year of the rejection of the constitutional treaty in France, first in the Netherlands and then in France. There was, of course, a 2-year reflection period until 2007. But let's say that in that moment, in my view, the lack of a narrative, historical or not, or forward-looking, as I was saying, was felt more than ever, and probably for the first time in a long time. Needless to say, the Lisbon Treaty, that was the product of rescuing part of the content of the constitutional treaty, didn't do the same job. I mean, it rescued the letter of the treaty, but not its symbolism. And to make things worse, when the Lisbon Treaty came into force in December, 1st of December 2009, the economic crisis had already started, 2008. So basically, momentum was nowhere to be seen in any way. So I think basically what I'm saying is that I think we're still pretty much in a situation that started in 2005, basically. And that was only deepened by the crisis. And that, in that context, finally, I think we're talking about 2010, 2011, 2012, the European institutions started being much more proactive about intervening or working on the field of memory, of history awareness. There was one of the initiatives was the New Narrative for Europe that was not necessarily about history. It had some historical components, but it was more this idea of finding a storytelling. Of course, I had noted here, but Yuvalin had already talked quite at length about it. In 2008, there was this important moment of the declaration on the crimes of Nazism. And actually, at the very beginning, I think you have said that, but at the very beginning was Nazism and communism, because I noticed also that, of course, yourself, you have been changing as it happened, of course, in reality. The initiative was the crimes of Nazism and communism, and it started, at least one of the sources was a written declaration or several written declarations in the European Parliament, and then they were transformed into resolutions. But I remember seeing at the time those declarations and seeing communism and Nazism on the same document. And actually, someone who approached me with this text, and he said, well, don't you think it would be better if you would change communism by Stalinism, because then the consensus would be more obvious, and because this poses a real problem in some countries, you know. Well, that person didn't talk to me anymore, but anyway, but in the, of course, as you have explained, in the end, in order to get to the plenary and to be approved, a number of adaptations in the wording needed to happen and did happen. The problem for me is that, of course, this is like the consequence of many filters and a lot of political correctness. But in everyday use, in the practice of things, such a confusion still very much exists. So basically, well, we say Stalinism, but in some places when no one is looking or not, then we say communism. You know, so this is an everyday thing, I think, in some settings, and I think that poses a problem for the kind of cohesion that we were talking about. But then, yeah, I think, well, you mentioned also, for example, the Europe for Citizens program. Well, now our colleagues left, but I wanted to mention also that during that time also the program, the Europe for Citizens program, was supporting itself and encouraging also the creation and the development of networks like the Observatory for European Memories, our two colleagues who are here, and then on the other side, the European Remembrance and Solidarity Network. It is important to see that the approaches of both networks, although they work together and there's an operational relationship between both and of collaboration, etc., is radically different. I think the Observatory for European Memories precisely strives for acknowledging the diversity of memory regimes and different memory experiences that are not sufficiently taken into account in Europe as a whole. Whereas I think the European Remembrance and Solidarity Network tends to stress more this binary opposition between, or not binary opposition actually, more like the centrality of how to say that, well, basically, yes, the equating, let's put it this way, the equating of Nazism and communism on both sides of the spectrum, let's say. So this is a real dialogue, a real, sometimes even tension that is happening on the ground, and something that I think as Europeans need to solve in the near future. And then in recent years, we have witnessed the emerging of illiberal democracy, but this is something that it's not just about Orban or Poland, but has to do also with Putin's holding onto power in Russia, or Erdogan's drifting far away from that sponsoring of the Alliance for Civilizations that was at the time, for example, was together with José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, the Prime Minister of Spain. Erdogan was within the framework of the United Nations, 2004, 2006, they were sponsoring this international campaign for the Alliance of Civilizations. And of course now, the Erdogan that we know now is very far away from that possibility of being, next to a socialist government in Spain, just being the advocate of plurality and religious tolerance and understanding in the world. So now of course, there is a completely different model, but also it has to do with Trump's election and with the trying out of capitalism without democracy that has been happening in China for decades now. So why I'm saying all that is very general? Well, because I think the coincidence of all these tremendous, let's say, factors in the recent years, especially 2014, 2015, and later, has been developing a syndrome in Europe of being besieged, basically, of being like, hold on, we are alone in this, in defending democracy, values, etc. So I think there has been, and I'm not saying that in an optimistic way, because of course, what is happening also is that has made make it harder within European countries to see the problems that exist even within Europe. But it's like everything is so bad out there that we are the only hope, basically. So, and again, I'm not saying that as a positive thing necessarily. I mean, it has had at least a positive effect of like, well, finally being more at ease about reflecting about history, etc., without constantly thinking that people are being brainwashed only because of doing that. But at the same time, there has been this sense of, well, Europe is the last hope worldwide because everything else is in disarray. I think one example of that we saw in the election of Macron. There was a moment of optimism, of saying, well, European values are back, etc. Of course, now, several years after that, the situation is very different in France, but at the time, it coincided with this boost of European feeling, more or less, in many areas. For the first time, there were like some pro-European demonstrations in the streets, and well, coinciding with Brexit, Ukraine. But even in France, for a moment, there was this symbology, European symbology out in the streets. I think this is fading again, actually, now. But I think in terms of linking that state of the public opinion with the very many institutional offer that was put forward, I think that propitiated like a better acceptance in the public opinion than one would have anticipated, I don't know, 10 years ago, for example. I think something like the House of European History, and well, I worked in the House of European History since the beginning in 2011, we were surprised ourselves by how, I mean, in spite of the criticism, etc., but you can, of course, the criticism, normally you can identify it quite well. You have talked about the deep criticism from the Polish government, but other than that, I think the reaction from the public opinion has surprised actually even the people who were working there, in the sense that all along during our work, we never thought it would be, let's say, that well received. And I think it's because, not because of the work we did, or not just, but also because there is, or there was almost, because again, I think it's very precarious, this moment of resurgence, let's say, of a certain pro-European spirit or state of mind. Well, I just wanted to maybe very quickly just show a few slides, because now what I wanted to do is just to see how, what would be possible in this situation in terms of solidarity, European unity, this more positive message, let's say, because of course sometimes European memory has been, or initiatives have been also criticized. I mean, it's not me speaking, I'm just saying, but about being centered almost exclusively about war. Well, here the memory of activism, of solidarity, of the links forged by war, but that were also about planning for the future and avoiding the repetition of war. It might be also a story to be told, and I wanted to, I don't know how to do that with the mouse. No, with the I don't know if it can, I don't know, or, yeah. So I'm just going to, I don't know if this will, sorry, or yeah, or just with that, yeah, I'm just going to move this, yeah. So I'm just going to mix a few examples from a more like propositive point of view with maybe some additional information about some of the initiatives that already exist, so that we can maybe critique them also, or, but to have a more complete maybe landscape of what is out there. So I'm just going to maybe mix a little bit my personal take on some of the potential for that narrative with what is already being done, and naming some of the initiatives that have happened. Of course, at the beginning I mentioned that I think this is something that there's a coincidence between some institutional initiatives, and for the first time some grassroots efforts, some even in outside institutions, some people who start working about that. I'm obviously more familiar with the first one, and I'm going to give examples primarily from the Parliament and maybe from other institutions, or not so much. I might mention some of the groupings here and there, but not so much about the second. But I do believe that the interaction between both is what makes this moment interesting, let's say, like maybe it could lead to something that makes a difference. So, well, when I'm talking about the memory of European unity in this respect, it's not just about, it's probably trying to go beyond this idea of, again, World War II as a founding myth, as it has been described for European unity. I think it would be important to expand also those origins and to go back to early visions of European unity, and also whatever that means, because of course the views in the 19th century were very different from what we can today make our own views. But this is something that from a historical point of view also makes a lot of sense. So it's not just like to choose the right genealogy that brings us to the present, but also to explore the views, even like 19th century dynasties after Napoleon had their own idea of Europe based on the brotherhood between monarchs, for example. So this is something that can be brought into this conversation of how many strands coexisted at the very beginning of the European thinking. I have just put here Victor Hugo as an example. Well, this is just also, again, to link with a specific example of what exists out there. The French Senate gave a bust of Victor Hugo to the European Parliament, and now it's part of the art collection, together with the first pages of the speech, 1849, when he advocated for the United States of Europe. Well, by coincidence, we are here almost exactly 100 years before the Schuman Declaration, 101 actually. But actually, it's exactly one century before. But it is an element that might be basically put into relation. Actually, in the Jean Monnet House, we have used this example as a forerunner of the thinking that then would generate something in the 20th century. Another, again, I'm centering a lot about the European Parliament in choosing my examples because that's what I know, but I just wanted to mention that the European Parliament, in expanding the existing offer of public history initiatives, let's say, has purchased recently a house that is literally next to the building, the big building of the European Parliament in Brussels, which is the house and the atelier of the painter Antoine Wiertz. Wiertz, I should have written that down, but it's W-I-E-R-T-Z, which is, by the way, also the same street as where the European Parliament is located, and it's just across the street. And the Parliament is is already creating a center for hosting events in a smaller scale. The town of Brussels has facilitated the selling, but also on the condition that has also a public dimension. So basically, the idea now is how to make compatible this more, I don't know, selected, the organization of more selected events that, because it's a small place with this public dimension, but the works of the painter are also part of this ensemble. And actually, it's a very interesting painter because he was almost living at the same time as Victor Hugo, and he was considered also someone very eccentric. And there's one of the things we see when we enter the atelier is a manifesto, not this also, but a manifesto saying Bruxelles capitale, Paris Provence. So this was kind of a boutade in the 19th century. Say one day Paris will be the capital. Of course, everybody, of course, come on, yeah, and Paris will be just. But I mean, why I'm saying that? Well, because those are, again, eccentric objects, but then might tell a story, might be used to tell a story. And another object that this is actually very big size painting, a set of three paintings. This is a painting also from Wiertz on the thoughts of a severed head. And this is inspired by the Victor Hugo work, Les dernières 24 heures d'un condamné à mort, which is a work against the death penalty. So again, there's this potential also for linking also let's say this European unity early thinking with the promotion of certain ideals that are still relevant to Europe today, etc. Well, big leap in time. Also important in this resurfacing of material for this storytelling about European unity, the experience of Spinelli as a founding father. This is The Island of Ventotene, the Federalist Manifesto of Ventotene. While in prison during Mussolini times, he wrote with the rest of the inmates, or some of the inmates in the penitentiary, what even today is considered one of the most ambitious views for a federal Europe. Why, and here's my own, let's say, personal contribution to the story. Why do I think this has enormous potential, again, for finding a different approach? During my work in selecting objects for the House of European History, I went to Albania, and I was Albania of all places, and talking to the head of the National Archives in Albania in Italian. She happened to speak Italian, and all of a sudden she said, yeah, we have a lot of material here about Albanian prisoners who were with Spinelli in Ventotene and helped him write the Federalist Manifesto. Of course, this is something that, again, I didn't have time to go back, well, maybe one day I will, but to go back and do the research that would require. But basically, there's a potential here to explain a history that has been almost completely neglected, which is, at the very least, between 1941, this document, and the beginning of the Cold War, or let's say basically until the Schuman Declaration, a history of European unity, of let's say the projection forward of the ideal of European unity that was continental in scope, in geographical scope. Because of course we always tell the story, there was Europe was divided, and then the western part, the Schuman Declaration made sure that the 6 leading countries of Western Europe were in agreement, and then from then on there was European unity, etc. Well, there is there's a lot of potential to retell this story starting from a different geographical scope that covers basically the whole Europe during World War II, but already with an eye on the future, on what happens after. And then also, even almost equally neglected, the years between the end of war, but the beginning of Cold War, but let's say, or the point of no return in Cold War. So I'm talking about roughly 45 until end of 48, 49. So basically with the Berlin embargo and then the Soviet bomb, it was obviously there. It was the point of no return. But if we examine what happened in between, we see a history that is very plural in the origins of the activists and the backgrounds and geographical provenance of people who were involved. And this story today is told from a very restrictive point of view, in my opinion. That's why I think. And by the way, I have this picture, but I forgot it back in Paris and in Brussels. There is an amazing object that could illustrate this from Ventotene. I have it in my computer, but which is, it's called the Vasoio di Ventotene. So it's like a platter that was offered to Spinelli or to some of the colleagues, that it's like almost a comic on this big plate that was handmade with a depiction of daily life in the prison, in the penitentiary, with Spinelli and different other people. And by the way, and this is, of course, I haven't researched that far, but you see Muslim people praying with the, so I don't know if that refers to the Albanians that were in the, it's just a guess, but it certainly, makes you wonder and makes you want to know more about what is depicted there. This is an object that we are actually, even now in the Jean Monnet House, negotiating to see if we can bring it from Italy. It's in Florence to be exhibited. But I think that those are objects that have the potential of maybe changing the perspective on a number of things. Again, 1948, big turning point for European unity. Again, not quite the usual storytelling, because the usual storytelling is more about the starting at the Schuman Declaration. But why is important here? Well, more than 700 people from all over Europe gathered in The Hague in 1948. It was the last time that some of the people could actually leave their countries because, you know, in Czechoslovakia, etc., were starting to, you know, there was the coup in Prague, etc. So things were going to the borders were starting to close in some respects, and restrictions for traveling were starting to be applied. But it was, again, almost day one of this European unity. You had people from all over Europe gathered in The Hague. There's an enormous quantity of gadgets and how to say that, of merchandising, we would call it today, linked to the Congress of Europe in The Hague. You can sometimes even can be like eBay, etc. You can find, yeah, it's true. It's like there's lots of objects that show that basically there was this publicity behind, and that this activism was, for example, this is a membership card of one of the pro-European activists from that year. But, for example, a case of cigarettes that was given to each participant of the Congress of Europe. Well, I mean, those things might surprise today because we don't envision how people could be mobilized at such a degree at that time to just basically be out in the streets and with banners and say we want Europe, etc. This is something that it almost creates disbelief almost when you hear that, you know. But for example, there's a partition also of an anthem that was a song that was created. So all the different 700 people sang the same song with speakers outside the building, etc. So yeah, there's potential for a lot. Well, here I have same year, and I think there's another important turning point, maybe here in a more, I don't know, bright way, and in a less bright way, in the sense that 1948 is the year when Paul-Henri Spaak, another founding father of European unity, gave his speech at the United Nations that is known as the speech of fear, the discours de la peur. And in my view, this reminds us about something that is usually neglected. This is a very personal view, but if we connect that with also the Nobel Peace Prize and we conclude all this narrative that has been developed is also axed on the idea that European unity is the product of peace and the product of idealism, etc. But I think it is often not acknowledged enough that it is also the product, or even primarily the product, of fear. And this is a story that needs to be told also. That in 1945, in 1945, European unity was a beautiful dream, let's say. In 1951, European unity was an absolute necessity for the leaders that were trying to govern Western Europe, because otherwise they could not distribute help, American help. They could not, let's say, or they thought they could not defend themselves against the Soviet threat, etc. So it is very important to acknowledge the difference between the ideal. Of course, the idealism laid the ground for all this, but the necessity and the geopolitics is what, in the end, took all that idealism and gave it a specific form, a specific materiality almost. By the way, here's the signature of the NATO treaty the same year, and Spaak himself was also a big promoter of the Atlantic dimension. He became Secretary General of NATO some years later, etc. So, well, we can here see even Spaak. We can see the duality of this idealism and this pragmatism and this fear in the same place, let's say. Okay, here's an object that we show at the House of European History. It's the first, but again, it's about showing here how one single object might have the potential of saying a lot. It's the first production of the coal and steel community that was started by the Schuman Declaration. So I don't know if we have no time, right? But Lam, what do you think? I had like because I wanted to click here and show a very short video that puts that in context, that we created also in the House of European History. And then I promise that I will skip some of the stuff that I have later, and because I think it's probably more interesting to. So we're good. The sound maybe is not.
The death and destruction of the Second World War made many dream of a united Europe.
After we see the
Fighting Nazi occupation had forged a sense of solidarity across many countries. And some European leaders knew unity could offer both peace and prosperity.
We must recreate the European family in a regional structure called, it may be, the United States of Europe. And the first practical step would be to form a Council of Europe.
Il est grand temps, à mon avis, que les pays de l'Europe occidentale essaient de collaborer les uns avec les autres.
La via da percorrere non è facile né sicura, ma deve essere percorsa, e lo sarà.
Many of these ideas came together at the Congress of Europe held in The Hague in 1948. As a result of the Congress, the Council of Europe was created in 1949. It was a first step towards bringing the countries of Europe together. During both World Wars, coal and steel had powered the military machine. In the 1950s, they became the first building blocks for lasting peace in Europe. In 1950, French Foreign Affairs Minister Robert Schuman announced that Germany and France would merge their coal and steel industries, making war between them not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. In all, 6 countries joined the initiative, signing the Treaty of Paris in 1951 to create the coal and steel community.
So that's the moment when Jean Monnet, president of the High Authority of the Coal and Steel Community, receives the product of the first production in Luxembourg on the Alzette-sur-Eche, I don't know how you pronounce that, in Luxembourg. And it's actually the letters, it's Europe without the A, because it works in all languages, because you skip the last letter, and then, so that was the symbolism. But, well, it's an object that at the House of European History we display. It comes from Lausanne, from the Jean Monnet Foundation. And we made sure that objects like that also, we put them in the context of a movie or of a visualization that provides a series of elements for interpretation of that object. So that's what I wanted to say. By the way, if you are, well, this is just the beginning. It's the movie goes almost until today. So it's the different stages of building European unity. And again, we made sure that we told that story not just with the institutional storytelling that is usually the norm, but linking that with the geopolitical context and the world context at each time. And I think that it's richer in detail. It's another way of hopefully, gathering some people's interest in expanding a little bit the boundaries of what you're saying. If we just tell them about the succession of commissioners or the high authority or the different configurations of the European institutions, people, of course, you cannot make sure that people follow because it doesn't have any interest. So this is part of the challenge, I think, in making this storytelling a little bit more interesting than it has been until now. So I'm just wrapping up because basically, well, I just wanted to show, for example, 2004. This is the venue of the signing of the Constitutional Treaty. One of the detective work that we had to do is to find one of those chairs, for example, and in the Netherlands, in Italy, then back in the Netherlands, then back in Italy, and finally we found one of those chairs in storage in Rome. But it took some letters and some searching, and now it's also exhibited in the House of European History as an example. This, for example, the box that we couldn't find yet, so the different pens that were given to the different signatories of the treaty, with this box with inscription in Latin. But then also you can see another side of all this. It's not, again, not just about boring institutional history. We were approached by a poet and former president of the Pen Club in Brussels and professor at KU Leuven also, who offered to contribute with a project that he had led, the European Constitution in Verse. So he had, at the time, encouraged poets from all around Europe, including Catalan poets, so the Catalan language is also represented there, writing the Constitution in verse before the actual Constitution was even presented. And this is something that it's also on display at the House of European History, and it shows another side of that moves far away from the institutional setting. And then again, just to conclude, and in all modesty, because this is the Jean Monnet House. This is again another one of the newest projects of the European Parliament. Since 2018, actually, July, it has become a new service of the European Parliament. But the House is actually the first property that was ever acquired by the European Parliament, because it was acquired already in 1983, only 3-4 years after Jean Monnet's death. Actually, now is exactly the 40th anniversary of Jean Monnet's death. And there will be an official inauguration of the renovated exhibition. Those are some of the things we have been doing with animations, a timeline. Well, I have only brought this slide, but there are many more with like an interactive table with showing all of Jean Monnet's life, but also creating animations with Jean Monnet, telling to the visitors about some of the main choices he had to make in his life, etc. Of course, this is, again, we're far away from history from a research point of view, but it's how we present history to society. Well, I think I have spoken enough, so I think maybe now we can just, there's